Read My Lips by Jennifer Munro. I had just given birth to our first child. My husband, Eric, leaned toward me and took hold of my face gently. An engineer by trade, he was not given to emotive endearments, but I knew this time must be different. Pulling his face mask down, he peered at me intently and whispered, "Read my lips, Jen. No pets." Now, in my chaotic household growing up, we'd always had pets, so I knew negotiating this fundamental philosophical difference between my husband and me would require great diplomacy on my part. Eventually, when we had two boys, Ben, who was 5, and Andrew, 3, I acquired a brightly coloured ceramic parrot in a macrame cage that I hung in the kitchen. The boys fed it peanuts while I kept up a constant chorus of "Pretty Polly, finish your breakfast, don't hit your brother," and a whole host of other useful parental directives which, because they came from the parrot, the boys religiously obeyed. Of course, the willing suspension of disbelief and the boys' fleeting obedience gradually disappeared at the same rate the uneaten peanuts grew in the bottom of the cage, and it was obvious that a real pet was required. A goldfish seemed a simple way to begin, and Eric, though not thrilled, agreed, failing to recognize this as the thin end of a mighty wedge. Nancy Bell arrived in the penthouse of fish bowls, and at the boys' request placed on the top of the dresser in their bedroom, a mistake I was soon to realize. In order to gaze at Nancy Bell together, Andrew pulled out the dresser drawers into a series of steps which they both proceeded to climb. The force of the dresser falling on top of the boys catapulted Nancy Bell and her glass bowl into the air. It hit the wall with a violent crash. The glass shattered and Nancy Bell fell to the floor, where she gasped for breath in a fast disappearing puddle. I dashed upstairs, and I think this establishes beyond any reasonable doubt the suspect quality of my parenting skills, because I took one look at Nancy Bell and promptly saved her rather than my children. Only when she was swimming happily in a saucepan in the kitchen did I return to rescue the boys. They gave a somewhat feeble cheer when I told them Nancy Bell lived. Though they loved Nancy Bell, they pointed out to their father the limitations of having a goldfish as a pet, and by contrast the enormous benefits of furry ones. So when they asked for a hamster and gerbil respectively, Eric, relieved they hadn't asked for a dog, caved in. And for a while the boys were content, until one day when they were in the utility room cleaning out the cages, Andrew's gerbil Gunga Din escaped and disappeared behind the washer and dryer, and I was summoned to help retrieve it. I placed the boys in strategic positions. When I bang on the washer, both of you get ready to catch him when he shoots out. They ran off to get their baseball mitts. When they came back, they crouched down into like seasoned players. Well, I pounded on the side of the washer, perhaps a little too enthusiastically, and a black missile shot out. Ben yelped and leapt into the air. Defying the law of gravity, he hung suspended for a moment. Only when Gunga Din was directly beneath him did he begin his inevitable deadly descent. Andrew and I closed our eyes and waited until we heard the anticipated crunch. Andrew let out a wail of despair, ran into the garage and locked himself in his father's car. Ben, sobbing, ran upstairs and locked himself in his bedroom. Meanwhile, the gerbil lay on its back with its legs flailing, blood pouring from its mouth. Now, whether from the horror of the situation or feeling totally inadequate to the task, I was suddenly gripped by an uncontrollable fit of laughter and collapsed in a heap upon the dryer. Another testament to my pathetic parenting skills. By the time I recovered, the gerbil lay dead. I found a suitable box and managed to coax both boys from their hiding places. And the ritual of a funeral seemed to calm everyone. The boys lined the coffin with green Easter grass, and they buried him under the apple tree. Andrew gave a short eulogy. "I still love you, Gunga Din, and want you to know that Ben didn't do it on purpose. Amen." The boys gave one another one of their rare hugs, and harmony was restored. Without Gunga Din as a companion, Hercules the hamster died a short time later, and once more the boys were back on the "we need a pet" trail. To Eric's dismay, the local children's farm where Ben and Andrew now belonged to the 4-H club was looking for a good home for a little Dutch rabbit. "And it comes with a cage and everything, Dad," said Andrew, as if this sealed the deal. Well, Eric groaned, and the rabbit moved in. We called her Minnie Ha-Ha. A little under 9 days later, she gave birth to 6 rabbits. We should have called her Minnie Haw-Haw, Eric muttered when he heard the news. So that's how we ended up with 7 rabbits, and to make matters worse, when we attended the local 4-H fair the following week, Andrew asked if he could buy raffle tickets. I said, of course. The prizes were stereos, a small TV and such, but Andrew didn't buy tickets for that raffle. He bought tickets where the prizes were a baby lop-eared rabbit, a guinea pig and assorted hamsters. When I learned the truth, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that he held one of the winning tickets. In fact, he held 2, and that's how we ended up with 8 rabbits and a guinea pig. "Close your eyes," I said to Eric when we got home. As a side note, as Flopsy, the adorable lop-eared rabbit, grew, she started to growl and look menacing whenever the boys cleaned out her cage. Eventually they were too terrified to clean it, and so the job fell to me, and I must admit I too was frightened. But asking Eric was out of the question. One day when I reached into Flopsy's cage, she not only growled, but she crouched down low and then attacked. I withdrew my hand to find that she'd sunk her teeth into the soft flesh of my palm. I tried to shake her free, but the pain was excruciating. I let out a blood-curdling yell. Eric and the boys came flying down the stairs. "Do something, Dad," shouted the boys, and to his credit, Eric rolled up an old newspaper and batted at the furry extension to my hand. "I'm not really sure," he yelled as he smacked at Flopsy, "exactly what the boys are supposed to learn from all of this, Jen, or am I missing the obvious?" Well, at last she released her grip and fell to the floor. We scrambled up the stairs to the kitchen and slammed the door. Eric washed my hand and wrapped it in a towel. "What do we do now?" he asked in his most sardonic voice. "Use a chair and a whip to subdue her?" I gave him a withering glance and called the breeder, who agreed to take away the marauding beast and Minnie Haw-Haw's offspring. So all in all, Eric thought it had been rather a good day. With just Minnie and the guinea pig, our home did seem rather empty, and it wasn't long before the boys were bemoaning their fate. "What they really want is a dog," Eric said one evening. "Perhaps if we get a dog, they'll stop wanting more animals." I didn't like to point out the fallacy of his argument, but a dog would be nice, I agreed. Sherlock, a beagle puppy, moved in a few weeks later, and of course the boys were thrilled. But instead of stemming their desire, it took our animal husbandry to a whole new level. Ben had begun to volunteer his time at the Little Red Schoolhouse, a nature centre close to our home. There then followed a range of refugee animals from the wild: a red-tailed hawk recovering from a broken leg, 4 abandoned baby kestrels, a rat snake, a bull snake, a garter snake, a few fire-bellied newts, a number of blue-spotted salamanders, turtles of various shapes and sizes, and, following a visit to a reptile show, an iguana. The local mice population must have heard we were a boarding house of sorts, because they flocked to our house like homing pigeons. Now, conveniently, Eric had organised an extended business trip, so I was left to deal with the problem alone. Now, at first I set up non-lethal traps, humane affairs at which the mice scoffed. They felt so much at home that one afternoon, as I was watching the early news, I looked around and there was a grizzled old mouse sitting on its haunches on the arm of the chair. When I got up, he didn't even move. I got a paper towel, scooped him up and shook him onto the lawn. Suddenly a hawk swooped down and flew off with him, and I'm not ashamed to say I experienced a quiver of satisfaction. When a mouse ran over me in bed one night, I finally drew the line. I purchased 24 mouse traps, the old-fashioned kind with the spring loader. That night I sat in the kitchen at the kitchen table, rolling whole wheat bread and peanut butter into solid balls, and for some strange reason, which I cannot explain even now, I started to sound like a demented pirate. The trick is, boys, is to bait the traps, but not set them. Ha ha ha! Lull them into a false sense of security. The boys looked at me askance and gave me a wide berth. The strategy worked. On the third morning, most of the traps contained the corpse of a tiny mouse. Remorse was a stranger to me. I purchased more traps. I was relentless and didn't rest until only one wily mouse remained. But no matter what strategies I used or what baits I tried, the traps were sprung and the bait disappeared. The boys were thrilled. "Houdini lives!" they cried each day when they checked the traps. I'd thought I'd met my match until one morning I found Houdini on his back, lying on the stairs. Blood trickled from the side of his mouth. Horrified, it dawned on me that he'd been caught in a trap and somehow freed himself. A wave of remorse crashed over me. Gently I wrapped my worthy opponent in a paper towel. The least we could do was give our hero a decent burial. We buried Houdini underneath the apple tree beside his domesticated cousins. But the strange thing was, when I went to gather up the traps, not one of them had been sprung, and I suddenly realized that Houdini had in fact died of natural causes. What are the odds of that happening, I thought to myself. But we all agreed in some strange way it was a fitting end. That is the way of the world. One by one our remaining pets met their demise in various ways. The boys too had grown up. Ben was at college and Andrew, a fireman, spent more time at the firehouse than at home. The last to desert the fast emptying nest was our poor old dog Sherlock. He'd been ill for a long time, and we knew that soon the inevitable would happen. The boys were prepared for this, and each in his own way had bid our faithful companion goodbye. Sure enough, one afternoon, I arrived home from work to find Sherlock in pitiful condition. It was winter time in Chicago, a blizzard howled, and the roads were treacherous. There was no one else home but me, but I knew I had no choice but to take him to the vet's. Gently, I wrapped him in a blanket and put him on the back seat of the car. I'd been to the optician's on the way home from work, and when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw that the whites of my eyes were still stained a bright orange from the drops they used to make my eyes dilate. There was nothing I could do about this now. I inched along the dangerous roads and finally made the turn into the vet's parking lot. Scooping Sherlock into my arms, I battled my way to the door, which flew open as I slid inside. I managed to stay upright and stared wildly at the office assistant. Alarmed, she leapt to her feet with her hand over her heart, as if this were a stick-up. "It's Sherlock," I gasped. "Oh, it's Mrs. Munro. I hardly recognized you." She took one look at Sherlock. "Oh dear. Bring him right in, I'll get the vet." I went into the examining room and the vet arrived and told me to put Sherlock on the floor. Wobbling, he tottered over to the examining table, where he managed to lift his leg and pee. "His parting shot?" I asked, the tears beginning to spill from my orange eyes. She nodded silently and left for a moment. I lifted Sherlock and held him close. I kissed him and told him what a good boy he was, and what a faithful companion he had been. When she returned, I put him on the table. I stroked him and whispered nonsense words as she administered the fatal shot. Slowly his eyes closed and his head and body went limp. It was so peaceful. I looked up at her. "Will you do the same for me when it's my turn?" We smiled at each other through our tears. I really can't remember how I got home. I called the boys and told them the bad news, and then Eric arrived home from work. He knew immediately what had happened. He took hold of my face gently. An engineer by trade, he was not given to emotive endearments, but I knew this time would be different. He enfolded me in his arms. There, Jen. It'll be all right. It'll be all right. Shh." He patted my back and held me while I sobbed my orange eyeballs back to white. At last, I was able to look up at him and say, "Read my lips, Eric. No more pets."